Hello and welcome everybody to this Strategic Sourcing webinar series. This is going to be the first of many such webinars on strategic sourcing and the various finer aspects of strategic sourcing. Since this is the first one, we will be, taking a high-level overview of strategic sourcing and a general introduction into various aspects of it. So this will be more of a 500 feet overview of strategic sourcing, and we will delve deeper into individual topics in the coming months. And I want to give you all a quick agenda of what's in store for us. This is the first time that I'm presenting, so I will start off with introducing myself and then also talk to you about strategic sourcing, although I'm assuming most of you will already know about it. And again, we will look into some numbers and pain points of what strategic sourcing is currently at. And then if you're a company that is looking to get into the path of strategic sourcing, or if you're a company that is already practicing some form of strategic sourcing, we will take a look at the approach to strategic sourcing, where you can either understand how to go about it, or recalibrate your current processes, audit them to see if they're working for you. We will take a look at the various elements of strategic sourcing methodology, as well as the key decisions that you have to make when it comes to strategic sourcing. That will then be followed by a very high-level process of strategic sourcing, how from start to finish you can implement a strategic sourcing process. This is, in my opinion, the most important aspect of strategic sourcing, because it has to be backed by a strong process, one that is constantly being adapted and recalibrated. I will also share some insights that I have acquired owing to my experience in this industry from the strategic sourcing process. We will then move on to current areas of focus in strategic sourcing. These are some of the areas that procurement professionals around the world are increasingly focusing on at this present moment, and we will briefly touch upon them. And we will then close with a quick summary of what we went through today, and followed by a question and answer session. So the way I see this happening is I will be speaking to you for the first 45 minutes, and we will reserve the last 15 or 20 minutes for a question and answer session. In order to ask a question, you can either type in your question in the chat window, or you can raise your hand, upon which I will unmute you. You've all been muted at this point. If you raise your hand, I will be able to see you, and I will unmute you and give you a chance to speak. Okay, I hope we're all clear, and let's go ahead and get started with the presentation. I was initially worried that there might not be a lot of participation because of the World Cup, but the match is already over, so we're good to go on that front. So let's get started. Since I'm presenting for the first time, I thought I'll give you a quick introduction about myself. I'm born and raised in India, and I went abroad to do an MBA, upon which I worked in the US for several years. I worked in a manufacturing firm called Terex. Terex makes earth-moving equipment. And I was in multiple roles in Terex, managed over 100 million of global spend across multiple categories. I was involved in transportation sourcing. I was also involved in operations where we implemented a lean manufacturing system. In terms of speaking and training, I've conducted several training sessions for my peers and others on ERP, lean manufacturing, as well as seminars on negotiation leadership and now strategic sourcing. I am also director of ISM India. I'm based out of Chennai, as I mentioned earlier. So I'm director of the Chennai chapter. I'm CPSM certified, and I also have set up a consulting company here in Chennai that does procurement consulting. It's called B-Cube Global Solutions, and so that's a little bit about me. So let's go ahead and get to the crux of this. What is strategic sourcing? Strategic sourcing is nothing but a formal sequence of logical and analytical steps that will help companies have a methodology in place with a focus on predominantly costs, but also improving efficiency, managing relationships with suppliers, and ultimately mitigating risk across the supply chain. And while we are getting into this, it's important to understand the difference between procurement and purchasing. Procurement is the way I see procurement is it's more of a newer concept, and typically people that do not understand the distinction between procurement and purchasing, they dismiss procurement as a purely tactical area. Most companies, of course it varies according to the industry, but total spend accounts for anywhere between 50 to even sometimes 90% of the total cost of your product. And as director of ISM, I've spoken to many Indian companies about how procurement is different from purchasing. So consider this example. Once a year, a company sits down internally, they identify savings target, buyers go ahead and prepare RFQ, send it to their existing supply base. They receive bids back from the suppliers, compare results, negotiate heavily, and let's say they are able to agree to a 10% reduction on cost at this point. They sign contracts, and then they go ahead and issue, they have a contract set up, and they go ahead and release purchase orders on that contract for the rest of the year. This is what I would call purchasing. The same process, pretty much the same, the process remains the same, but if there is an element of strategy that surrounds it, wherein you go ahead and let's say instead of getting the 10% reduction, you do the analysis, you are able to get supporting data, and you can tell your supplier that it shouldn't be 10% reduction in cost, but exactly 30% or some other number like that. That is what I would call a more strategic element to it, rather than being reactive to situations. Strategic sourcing empowers you to be more proactive, and you get ahead of situations before they occur and drive progress for favorable conclusions, and that is what I would call procurement. So when done right, this is a number that we have seen. Typically from my experience, when done right, strategic sourcing can help companies save anywhere between 4% to 20% based on the industry, the level of maturity of procurement in their organization. And what exactly comprises of strategic sourcing? It can be a lot of factors. It can be analytics and reporting. It can be contract management. It can be category sourcing, vendor management, as well as tail spend management. These are all some of the various activities that one would pursue within strategic sourcing, and I will go ahead and expand upon the various aspects of strategic sourcing later. But this is I put this slide out there to show companies and show you what the opportunity that is in lying out there. And another important point to note, especially in this current scenario, is that it's dependent on the economy as well. So I was fortunate to work in the US through the depressive climate of 2008, and the importance of the procurement function to a company at TEDx was that we had we went down from 21,000 in total globally to about 14,000, and that that is 33% of the organization, but the company did not cut a single staff in procurement. And that is why I want to say that procurement is the most significant activity in a down economy, because typically when the economy is growing and it's going great guns, cost is never a priority. Cost, companies always, and that's understandable, companies want to focus on revenue maximization and they don't focus so much on costs. But in a down economy, procurement becomes very important because you focus on lowering cost and improving the quality of your supply base, and eventually you try to get into contracts that will help you, that will benefit you in the long term. So you can get into contracts at a lower cost structure, and if once the economy eventually rebounds, which it will, we're on the cusp of a rebound right now, that way you can maximize your returns. And so the other thing that I did for this webinar was trying to understand what best-in-class companies do in strategic sourcing. So, and I was able to use Aberdeen Research, which is a great resource. I must encourage you all, if you have the time, for any type of procurement or supply chain research, you can use the Aberdeen group. It's free, and it's free. You just need to register, and you can use the Aberdeen Insights. So we try to understand, what best-in-class companies do in procurement that sets them apart, and the results were, it's easy to observe why they do so well. So 77% of best-in-class companies have adopted technology to automate and improve sourcing and negotiation. And by technology, it doesn't have to be something fancy, a really expensive tool on a cloud base, but you have some technology that works, that helps you get the job done. That is great. 81% have a formal sourcing process to drive down costs and improve quality. And it is important not just to develop a process, but also ensure that checks and balances are there to make sure you stick to the process, because a process is only as good as the discipline in following it. 84% are performing proactive analytics to identify patterns that will help them in the long term. 89% have a formal program to monitor performance of your supply base, identify and mitigate risk even before it occurs. And the most significant aspect of it was 93% invest heavily in training and expose their staff to best practices and methodologies. And I want to share another experience of myself. Let's see if there is time. Yeah, there seems to be some time, so I'll quickly rush through this. I was one of my roles at TEDx was to source steel fabrications from lower cost countries. So we had India and China competing over a particular bid, and the reason I'm going through this is to emphasize on the point that while all these numbers and all the technology and all the training and programs are good, a lot of it is also dependent on attitude. So in this RFQ that we did, we had a lot of participation from suppliers in India and China, and this was on an online platform. So we put this out there, and there were only a handful of companies that were that immediately started working on the bid as soon as the drawings were received. So the drawings are shared on an online platform, and a few suppliers that I thought would do very well from India, they didn't really work on their bid until about 1 week before the RFP was going to close. And typically, as you know, as any student would do, they would start preparing for the exam the day before, right? And so that is exactly a similar approach which most Indian companies adopted, and the companies, other companies across the world, they were much more proactive in understanding, downloading the drawings, asking our engineering team questions, and so on. And all these matter a lot to if you're in an export market. All these matter a lot. So it's the overall point is that while technology and process are important, people and attitude is also equally important. And moving on to the next slide, so I also want to address what organizations face. I mean, it's easy to make a bunch of PowerPoint slides and say, hey, this, you should do this, you should do that. But again, it is also important to understand what organizations are going through. And trust me, it's especially procurement, there is pressure from everybody around to cut costs, increase efficiency, maximize profitability. I mean, you're juggling multiple roles you're juggling, and you have multiple targets. So it's really very hard. And there are not just that, but there are resource constraints, and time is not your best friend. There's typically most procurement professionals, whether they like it or not, they are always chasing down suppliers for either financial issues or lack of delivery or lack of quality, and oftentimes a lot of time is wasted with suppliers. Then there is also heavy attrition sometimes, where you invest heavily in employees and the best often leave. So it's important to keep your employees happy at whatever cost. But ultimately, what this all leads into is you start taking it out on the supplier. You try to squeeze the supplier to get the maximum cost savings out, and that I think is a supplier should be viewed as a partner, and that is a very highly disturbing trend that has been increasingly prevalent over the last few years. So these are some of the pain points that we face, and I think strategic sourcing methodology is a great way to overcome this. And what exactly is strategic sourcing? Let's take a look at the approach towards strategic sourcing. So companies typically have to make the quantum leap from a reactive purchasing to a more proactive strategic sourcing methodology. And how do they do that? One is by empowering your people. Most often the change, if it is driven from internal rather than external third-party organizations, I think it's a more lasting and more powerful change. So the change has to come from within. You would have to look at your processes and adopt best-in-class strategic sourcing processes used by industry leaders. Invest in technology and implement tools that help make the job of your people and enable the processes to become more efficient. And not just this, you should also inculcate a culture of continuous improvement. Not be happy with a single year savings, but look at year-on-year savings. All these together is a transformation that you make from a reactive purchasing organization to a strategic sourcing organization. And now that you understand all this, what is next? How do you approach strategic sourcing? And this is a slide. This has a lot of individual elements, so I will explain it step by step. This is what we call a procurement operating model, and an operating model is a foundation behind a strategic sourcing organization. And this is pretty much all of procurement in a nutshell, although, because it's so small, because I'm trying to put everything on one slide, I might have left out a few things, but you see the house is built on a foundation. It has various aspects of it. We'll go from top down. Strategy is something that defines what you do as a procurement organization, and the daily work and tactical responsibility defines how you do what you intend to do, and the tools and methodology at the bottom help you actually do. So this is the way you understand the various three aspects of it. And again, procurement being in the center, you're at a key role because you're managing internal stakeholders, that is your corporate vision on the left, and you're also in the middle, you're the face of your company to your supply base. And so let's, a strong foundation is vital, and the various aspects of a procurement strategy up top you will consider is the organization structure, how you organize yourself as a procurement organization. We'll briefly touch upon that later. And governance and compliance issues, how you, set forth how you comply, how your contracts are structured, how your internal categories are governed and structured, and as well as trying to understand how you're performing. So there is a lot of analysis and reports which is almost a self-audit as to how procurement is performing internally. And once you have this strategy in place, the next aspect of it is to define daily work. So you have a clear strategy in mind, and how this translates into the various aspects of tactical responsibility, which will be how you go about sourcing projects, how you source, how you go about establishing and managing various categories, how you manage your internal stakeholders, how you manage your suppliers, and also set up processes. I have requisition to pay there. It's one of the more critical processes in procurement, but there are lots of other processes as well that you have to establish. And once you have all this in place, you have to have tools that help you implement. So, when I say tools, I'm not purely talking about information technology and so on, but training and development is a huge part. Having a clear category strategy works really well during implementation. Also developing supplier scorecards, vendor management frameworks, and so on. So this, we can go back to this often, but if you want to understand what are the various aspects of a strategic sourcing organization, this will comprise of mostly 80–90% of this will be covered by just this house, the procurement operating model, which we would call. And what sets, we earlier discussed best-in-class organizations, and we understand that with times are constantly changing, there are new technology, new tools that are in place. There is a need for modern corporations to be agile, dynamic, and very responsive to changes. So the ones that are at the forefront are typically ones that are constantly upgrading their technology, periodically reviewing the processes, and investing in training. So once we have a foundation set up, the next, I talked to you about certain aspects of strategy, right? So one is the organization structure. So as you understand, there are two main ways of operating within a procurement organization. One is a highly centralized structure where decisions, considering let's say you are a company that has 20 branches across the country, and a centralized operating model would dictate that all the decisions for 20 branches across the country will be made in a centralized headquarters. So, and the exact opposite of that is a decentralized structure where each of the 20 operates as individual procurement organizations. So I will just, I'm just going to briefly touch upon the benefits and the challenges to both approaches. So in a centralized approach, you get greater economies of scale. So you're able to combine purchases and you're able to negotiate better discounts, and you also get, improved control and visibility into your the spend. And since there is one organization that's making policies and defining processes, it's easier to make policies. But the downside of that is that in a centralized approach, there are 20 different smaller branches, and the small players typically tend to get overlooked. It's the big boys that are often considered in terms of strategy or any policy, and small players tend to get overlooked, which is not a good thing. While it's easy to make policies, implementation of those become much harder because each entity operates separately, and this is not always the case, but based on the organization, sometimes the goals and objectives of the centralized procurement team as well as the individual operations team might not be aligned. And on the other hand, with a decentralized approach, hold on a second. On the other hand, with a decentralized approach, it's the exact opposite. So the goals are often aligned closely to what the individual plants want. The changes, can be made quite easily, and this is an important aspect of it. You have strong supplier relationships in a decentralized model because you're an organization that has 20 branches across the country will have, let's say, 2,000 suppliers, and with a centralized approach, it's impossible to be on good terms with, or at least in close contact with all 2,000 suppliers. But a decentralized approach helps you do that. But again, the downside of that is that you can never maximize savings. You can always generate savings, but a centralized approach offers you much more. Strategy is always splintered, so you will never have a consistent procurement strategy for the organization as a whole. And again, another byproduct of this is that within the same organization you will have multiple tools, multiple processes. It becomes really cumbersome if somebody were to come in and try to change that. But increasingly, and this is a trend that has been I've seen for the past 5 to 10 years, and this is a trend that I foresee improving, is a matrix structure in procurement organization that seeks to get the best out of both of these approaches, and there is a greater emphasis on a more centralized structure. So I would say anywhere between 60 to 70% of a centralized structure and 30% decentralized structure. The combination is what we call a matrix approach. This is increasingly being followed in organizations across the world. The next major decision is on processes and governance. We talked about the purchase to pay process, and this is an important process that covers right from requisitions to purchasing to receiving to paying as well as accounting. So it is imperative that you spend a lot of time looking at your procure to pay process, purchase to pay or procure to pay, you could use them interchangeably. Constantly re-evaluate to see if that is working, identify if there are any gaps, and so focus on that heavily. The governance aspect of it is that you have categories and commodity strategy. So there is a category management framework and an individual strategy for every category. Every category is different. For example, if you're let's say a manufacturing organization, the way you purchase steel or procure steel will be highly different from the way you procure engines, let's say. So it is imperative that you treat each category separately and have individual strategy. And then you also have to manage your contracts. You should have to focus on your contract lifecycle management as well as compliance monitoring. So the benefit of spending time on both these aspects is that there is increased financial and you are more efficient, you generate greater cost savings as well as retaining greater control. And this is one of my favorite subjects to discuss in strategic sourcing is the use of technology. I mean, with the advent of these modern tools, we are almost enveloped by tools that promise to deliver the entire, I mean, they say anything that you need, we can get it to you. I mean, these are cloud-based, these are available on your tablets, these are available on the go, anywhere that you want. But again, while it's important to have technology, we also have to consider the following aspects of it. There are certain enterprise-wide tools that will take care of all the aspects of procurement that we discussed earlier. They will take care of the entire procure-to-pay process. They will take care of your contract lifecycle management. They will take care of your vendor management. But the downside is that, while it sounds great, this tool will possibly be really expensive, and almost it will take a lot of time to implement such a tool. So some organizations, and this is obviously based on what the organization wants, the size of the organization, the level of maturity, they have multiple individual tools that come together to perform the various individual functions. Another decision that you would have to make is whether would you like to invest in a tool or would you like to invest in a service that performs the same function, and how you deal with gaps as and when they come up. So with processes and technology, this is an important distinction that you'd have to make. It is imperative that an organization develops the process for strategic sourcing first before implementing a tool. So oftentimes, an organization wants to get into strategic sourcing and they end up investing in a tool, and they expect the tool to define the various processes that should happen. And I think that is not the way to go, if you ask me. I think the process that you have inbuilt into your procurement organization should drive how your tool functions. It should be the other way around, and technology shouldn't drive your processes. And we already talked about the various considerations. So the enterprise tools are very expensive. You need to spend time on integration in terms of multiple tools. And then there is complexity if there are multiple tools. And as I mentioned earlier, processes win technology. Let's move ahead and look at, this is the last area of strategic decisions that one would have to make is workforce, and this is very, very important. People make organizations successful, not technology, not processes, not strategy. I understand all these various aspects are important, but it is ultimately the people that are most important part of a strategic sourcing initiative. And nothing can beat having a highly trained and motivated staff. And if you have that in place, I think you can execute better. And for example, you give me a brilliant plan that can never, that will face implementation challenges, I will never go for it. I will go for even a bad plan if implementation, I wouldn't say bad plan, obviously nobody would want to execute a bad plan, but a simple plan that can be executed efficiently will any day trump over a great plan, great strategy that's executed poorly. And some of the various consideration as far as workforce go is having the right network of people, create processes and policies that facilitate working together and constantly challenge your workforce, invest heavily in training and development of your staff, and exposure to best practice. So you need to constantly engage either third-party services or however you want to do it, to challenge existing processes, because that is how you will grow as an organization. So I think we've covered a little bit about the various strategic aspects of the decisions you make and how you go about strategic sourcing. Now let's get into the crux of it. What is the actual process? So as I mentioned earlier, we will only briefly look at this in this webinar, and I will spend more and more time on the various steps in the process as we go along, because spend analysis is one of the aspects, let's say, and it's a huge ocean. We would need 45 minutes to go over the various aspects of spend analysis. So which is why I want to give you a high-level overview of the process. And this process is something that we've developed over time. We've spent thousands of man hours, and you will look at various consultants. They will have a process similar to this. This is mostly the same. So phase one is where you get into. So before even phase one, I want to talk to you about the three major phases. Phase one is on top, phase two in the middle, and phase three at the bottom. Analysis is phase one, execution is phase two, and implementation is phase three. So before even you get in, what you need to really understand is what you are buying. And so let me give you an example. If you go out and buy, if you're in the market to buy, let's say, a pen, a writing device. So you can either buy a pencil, you can either buy a roller ball or a ballpoint pen, or you can buy the ink pen. If the need is a ballpoint pen, you have to understand that you're actually buying a writing device that is cheaper, that can be easily replaceable, the recurring cost is low. While this is what I would call is defining a commodity profile. Once you really understand what you're buying, it becomes so much easier to formulate a strategy around it. So once you clearly understand the commodity that you're buying, and you can identify trends and so on, it's easy to formulate a strategy around it. And that is the preliminary aspect of it. The next, once you've understood what you're buying and once you understand, so aspects of a sourcing strategy would be whether you single source an item, or you have multiple sources, or what is the percentage split if you have multiple sources. Are you buying from local suppliers, or are you buying from low-cost suppliers? So these are the various aspects of a sourcing strategy. Next is, once you know what you're buying and you have your strategy, understand the supply market, where you develop rules try to understand which suppliers will be a good fit for you. And this should be done even before going and understanding the market. So this should be done internally, where you develop a list of criteria for which suppliers will work best. And this is an important step, because you want to align your supplier goals to that, procurement goals to that of the organization. For example, lean manufacturing is one of the goals of the organization you work for. Having a supplier that is also lean will go a long way in strengthening that relationship. So this is just one example. So have a list of criteria for supplier selection. One second. Excuse me. So, and once you have a list of supplier selection criteria, the next is understand the supply market and generate a list of suppliers. And that will end phase one. And once you have a list of suppliers, you take them through a primary screening where you have your financial criteria. You have, let's say, ISO certifications as one of the some of the examples. So you generate a long list of suppliers, and this should include your current supply base as well as new alternatives that come up. And Once you take them through a primary screening process, you get a short list of suppliers, which you will then take through an RFI, which is a request for information, where you audit them for operations, size, and so on. It's a self-auditing mechanism. And then you have a target list of suppliers which you will include in the actual RFQ or RFP. And after the RFP, you will typically want to perform a site assessment on the supplier that you intend on working with and end up choosing the best value supplier rather than the best cost supplier. Once you have this, we will also, once you've selected the supplier, you have to have an implementation plan in place wherein you onboard a particular supplier. And this is, organizations are currently being challenged by onboarding suppliers, where it's tricky. It's not as easy as it seems, because there is often, when you identify a new supplier, there is great resistance from your current team, because who is not resistant to change? We are happy with status quo. But constantly changing is the way we move forward. So we'll have to have a plan in place to overcome the resistance to change, as well as getting used to working with somebody new. Constant communication between the supplier and yourself is the key, and you make sure the transition plan has all this covered. So you have processes that will ensure that the onboarding is smooth. And phase 3 ends with a performance monitoring. This is a whole new ocean which we will tackle in a separate webinar. This will be assessing your vendor performance, doing market analysis, and constantly continually improving. So some of the insights of this sourcing process is that the supplier screening, most organizations do not tend to spend a lot of time on this, but it is very important. I have personally felt, we once did an RFP for decals, which decals are something that you go on, if you have a truck, those are all the various stickers that go on a truck. And we did an RFP for decals, and since we thought, decals is not that important, and this was way back. I mean, I shouldn't be saying this as a procurement professional, but this is what we did. We said, hey, decals, it's no big deal. So let's just go ahead and do the bid directly. And we never spent a lot of time on the RFI, and we did screen suppliers. So we got a great bid from a new supplier, which we said, hey, this is great, that he offered a great savings. But then once we went out and tried to implement, that is when all hell broke loose. So this supplier screening, most organizations don't do this. You should. It is very important. And a comprehensive bid document is also very important. So if in your RFP, you define everything, so including specs, material requirements, all the various delivery constraints, clauses, conditions. The supplier, if he's trying to understand what it is that he's bidding on, he should get a complete understanding of what he's getting into just by looking at the RFP bid document. You also have to have clear criteria on choosing the right supplier, and total cost of ownership is very important. Most organizations are trying to develop internally a total cost of ownership framework model, especially when comparing bids. So, and an important point to make is in the process of the RFP, you have to clearly define how it is a supplier is bidding. You have to clearly say, is it per unit or per length or whatever be it, it's which currency they are bidding, so that once you receive the bids, it becomes easy to compare multiple bids. And ultimately, once you have the right supplier, you also have to have negotiation. And this is a pretty important aspect where, they say 50%, not even 50, I would go as far as stretching it to 75%. 75% of a negotiation happens before the actual face-to-face interaction. And this is something that people from Asia are really good at, because we don't like spending money, right? So we negotiate every day in our life. We negotiate with our boss, at home with our family, we negotiate. Of course, it makes it easier for us to negotiate with vendors. But what is important is to have a lot of preparation, understanding their viewpoint, understanding your viewpoint. And for negotiations, I would recommend, there is a book called Getting to Yes. I think it's by Fisher and a couple of others, but it's a great book. It tells you the various aspects of a negotiation, how you prepare, and how you go about setting your strategy around negotiation. So ultimately, what you want to do is be the godfather. You want to make an offer to the supplier that they cannot refuse. And this pretty much summarizes, some of the insights of the process, the strategic sourcing process, and the insights from it. I also want to talk to you briefly. We're running short of time. I'll spend the next 5 minutes talking about current areas of focus. Indirect spend is one area that is seeing increased visibility right now. What is indirect spend? Is all the area. So it's important to understand the distinction between direct purchases and indirect purchases, as most of you would already be knowing. Direct purchases are those that go directly on the product or service that you're building. So let's say you are manufacturing a car. The tires, the steel cabinets, the seats, the steering wheel, the brakes, they're all direct examples of direct categories. And what indirect categories are is what you spend on marketing, advertising, you spend professional services, you spend on facilities, you spend IT. And these are all the things that will add up to the total cost of the product without directly being on it. So that is the indirect. And organizations that are fairly mature have taken this to the next level. So the next aspect of indirect spend, to take it to the next level, is what we call tail spend management. So the tail, and this is something like a whale in the ocean, the tail is the last aspect of it. If the whale is the procurement spend, the tail is the last aspect of it. So typically the last 10-15% of your indirect spend will be what is called your tail spend, and this will comprise of thousands of vendors, and this will only account for less than 1% of your total spend. And that is an area, because procurement organizations are increasingly becoming more strategic, they've initially done the 80-20 rule. They focused on the 80% of spend, and next they've shifted their focus to the 20% of spend. They've achieved some progress, and this last aspect of it is the tail spend. And if let's say you're just getting started with an indirect spend strategy in place, there is indirect spend can easily save you 5 to 8% of your total annual spend. There is a lot of opportunity with indirect, and not just cost savings. You can also drive contract compliance. You can benchmark your price. You can strengthen policy and governance, and also consolidate suppliers, because the cost of working with, let's say, 1,000 suppliers is definitely going to be exponentially more than the cost of working with, let's say, even 700 suppliers. So all these add to this, and indirect spend has been an area of focus for organizations, and increasingly it's now shifting to tail spend. This is another area that is companies are focusing on is transportation and packaging. Well, transportation, it means more to do with, it can be network optimization, where you're doing route planning both inbound and outbound, and you're setting up milk runs, you're setting up consolidation points at various aspects in your logistical chain. You're also trying to integrate transportation providers or 3PLs. 3PLs are a great resource for companies, because if, let's say, you're a manufacturing company, a company should stick to doing, what they're good at, which is making the best car. Let's say if they're manufacturing cars, the company should stick to their core, which is making an amazing car. Transportation is something that is not typically their core, and it makes sense for, the experts to come in and provide what they are. So most companies have gone with the 3PL strategy for transportation, and you create logistics partnerships also. Warehousing is also an area that is increasingly becoming strategic and important, because you see that most organizations are running out of space internally at their various facilities, and they are working a lot with warehouses to ensure just-in-time daily deliveries, as well as maximizing the space internally within their facilities. Key areas of looking at are replenishment and EOQ, which is estimated ordered quantities. These are some of the areas that organizations are looking at, and as well as packaging. Adopting more returnable containers that have high initial cost, but again in the long run that will help you reduce the costs, and also maximizing the most out of a particular packaging structure. So if you have a pallet or if you have a container, you have to package it to the best where you get the maximum return for a particular piece. And I think with these, I want to leave you this. We've come to a little end of this first part of this webinar, and what I want to do before closing is that I will quickly rush through the various aspects that we've covered so far. So if you give me a couple of more minutes, I will just briefly touch upon the various aspects that we covered in this webinar, and I also want to provide you some information on future webinars. I'll do that at the end of the summary. So let's go back to the beginning and just go through what we discussed. Okay, so we'll stick to this, and we'll start from here. So we initially looked at the growing impact of procurement, trying to see what are the various aspects of which companies are working on, why it's important to work to look at cost in a troubled economy and make maximum use of it in a flourishing economy. We also try to understand what best-in-class companies do, and most of the results were adopting processes, technology, and what is also important is developing people with the right attitude, because a great attitude goes a long way in taking your organization to the next level. We also talked about typical pain points at organizations where you don't have resources, you don't have a lot of time, you have constant attrition, and you end up taking it all on your suppliers, which is not the right way to go about it. A better way is to have a more formal, proactive risk mitigation process, which is what strategic sourcing is. And the various aspects of a strategic sourcing process are people, processes, technology, and a culture of continuous improvement. So this is the transformation that you should be looking for. And we took a look at the foundation of strategic sourcing, which is the strategy, the tactical responsibility or daily work, as well as the various execution tools that help you actually drive the change. And how all these come together and the importance of this. And we also discussed briefly the need for corporations to be agile, dynamic, and responsive. So it's doing this one time is not a great thing. You should constantly reevaluate to see if all these elements are working and recalibrate as necessary. Some of the decisions that you make are whether you adopt a centralized or a decentralized approach, and a matrixed approach is what is a great. It gets the best of both worlds, and increasingly organizations are adopting such an approach. We looked through the importance of various processes where it's imperative that you have clearly defined processes with minimal gaps, and you also have proper governance within your procurement with clearly established categories, subcategories, strategies, and contracts, and so on. And this will help you generate greater savings, improve efficiency, puts you in greater control of your supply chain, and provides increased visibility. Importance of technology, various options available. There are enterprise-wide tools available. There are multiple individual tools, how they come together, and how processes should drive technology implementation, not the other way around. We also talked about the importance of training your staff and making sure they're motivated and highly trained. constant exposure to best practices, and so on. And we took a look at the various high-level look at the processes, which we'll expand on in the coming webinars. Phase 1, which is a lot of research, preliminary research, creating profiles and supply market analysis. And the phase 2 is the actual execution phase, which is the process of which we would call a sourcing event, which would be a primary screening, an RFI, and an RFQ. And phase 3 is the implementation phase, where you onboard a supplier, understand their performance, and keep, set up processes for continuous improvement. We looked at some of the insights of the strategic sourcing process. Supplier screening is very important. A comprehensive RFP is key. Establishing a total cost of ownership model to choose the right supplier is great, and also the importance of negotiation. We briefly also touched upon a couple of areas of focus in procurement, which is indirect spend, and increasingly we looked at tail spend, which is the last 10% of your indirect, which most mature organizations are now looking at. And there is a lot of opportunity with indirect. There is 5 to 8% of your total annual spend based on your current level of maturity in procurement. Indirect spend is a great area of focus. It can help you drive contracts, compliance, price benchmarking, strengthen your policy, and supplier consolidation. We also looked at transportation and packaging, network optimization, 3PLs, warehousing, and packaging. So that's that. If you have any questions at all, you feel free to ask them now, but you could also email me at either one of these email addresses, my BQ Global, which is my company based in Chennai, or the ISM India email. You can also feel free to take a look at both websites where you have a wealth of information, and I've also listed my mobile number here if you have any questions. So thank you again for your time. I hope this was a good use of your time, and